Okay.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of the Melting Scot podcast. And thank you very much for joining us. So today we have with us Rebekah Cheung, who is painfully self-obsessed, a Glasgow Uni world changer, sexual assault survivor and activist, business graduate, and currently works with White Ribbon Scotland to tackle gender-based violence by including men in the solution. And she is also the founder of Be Like Lilith, a sexual assault-based organization that works to support survivors through the health and recovery process. And we are ecstatic to have you here today with us, Rebekah.
Hello.
Yeah. So
Yep.
I guess today we're going to be discussing your blog post that you had up on the Melting Scot webpage, which is recognizing my privilege within rape recovery. So could you just talk us through the blog post, like sort of like motivations for writing it and just kind of your experiences? And there's quite a lot on the blog post to talk about.
Yeah. So essentially it was just realizing within kind of like a very broken system anyway. And it's painfully bad.
Mm-hmm.
I think for a really long time I was so incredibly focused on then why I wasn't getting the justice that I deserved,
Mm-hmm.
without realizing obviously within that it's then this huge issue of how me being white then actually put me at a much more beneficial position. Even though the system is still incredibly broken, I am still one up, so to say, as than someone who is of BME background.
Okay. I mean, I guess for like the listeners and things like that, I mean, I guess a lot of people would ask, what does that look in reality when you say that you're like one up in the system? How are you slightly more supported, or are you able to tell us?
Yeah, so there's this huge thing in obviously like believing someone when they come out with their story, how difficult that can be, and kind of like having obviously a huge part of any kind of rape recovery is being believed and having that help in place. I was never not believed. That was never an issue for me. Something I thought was the same for everyone. And then obviously doing my reading and then seeing kind of more through it and researching it more, it was just this idea that actually, no, the color of someone's skin can stop them from being believed, in the sense that it's a lot of the time they think it's crying wolf. I don't remember the exact statistics, but it's this whole idea that if you're, let's say, if you're black, you're a lot less likely to be believed than, say, someone like me who
Mm-hmm.
comes off white.
And I guess the aspect people are asking is like, who doesn't believe? I mean, you're talking about the community in general. Are you talking about like police? Are you talking about community support organizations? I mean, how does that all?
So when we kind of go into that, there's this big kind of like hoo-ha being like, well, actually, it's their own communities that don't believe them. Therefore, it's a race within race issue. It's not. That is the case. There is obviously kind of that hush hush, say with more like that kind of like traditional cultures. That is right. However, you've then got this big issue of number one, the police not believing. Police is a lot less likely to believe a BME survivor. Then whether they get therapy. I think it's very well known that the NHS waiting list is bad anyway, but I was able to eventually get my help, whereas it's a lot longer process for people of BME background, which is obviously something you don't really notice when it's not happening to you.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, seeing kind of such a broken system in terms of the police, but then also within like the healthcare system where they're supposed to care, that's the whole point. That's broken anyway, but it's then further broken when it comes to race.
So I guess the aspect you're talking about for some people is obviously the cultural aspect. And for example, obviously I come from like a South Asian background, and there's obviously the aspects of honor. So I guess this brings into the aspects of like, honor-based violence and the sort of tangents that takes us on in terms of like, the breadth of where that's involved in. During my sort of time at university, I mean, I was aware of a number of women who were involved in relationships and things like that turned quite sour.
Yeah.
And things like, not as far as, I mean, as far as rape in some instances happened. And I guess I knew from their experiences that essentially they couldn't go to their parents, they couldn't go to their siblings, they weren't meant to be in a relationship anyway, according to their family. So how do you go from not meant to be in a relationship to being like an active sexual relationship with whoever you're with, to them doing something that you cannot go to your own family with? And as you're saying, as you approach the police and things like that, the level of support or the level of just generally for the general population, I'm aware of my meetings that I've had with the police through my sort of like own job and things like that. I'm aware of how low the also the prosecution rate is for this, or how far they can go, or what can they possibly do. If it was like a week ago, a month ago, a year ago, they try to look towards evidence and things like that, and no one's denying in some cases, like, you had sex, but then how do you prove, obviously, something that happened 6 months ago, 7 months ago, as you're slowly coming to realize to what had happened, or at least building up the courage to be able to interact with organizations and things like that should be supporting you there, like you're saying, like the NHS or health services. So I wanted to go back to like some of the things that you'd kind of outlined within your blog post about your own, like, sort of if you're comfortable with it, obviously your own like situations, your own stories that you'd spoken about during the blog post.
So no, go ahead.
Go ahead.
So yeah, no, I think it's very much like what you've just said. It's obviously that realization thing. So when I was first assaulted, I was in my second year of university, but I didn't know it happened. Like, I didn't realize what had happened was rape, and it took me a very long time until I kind of understood that. It then happened again, and it happened on a third occasion. And I think what I outlined in the post was this idea that the first person who assaulted me was someone I considered my friend. The second was kind of a complete stranger, and then the third being someone I was in a relationship with. So it was kind of that experience of, well, it doesn't really matter kind of what relationship you have with a person. If they're wanting to assault you, they will assault you. That's down on them. And I think it's this huge idea that it not being the victim's fault, but that kind of just was highlighted in the fact that it doesn't matter. It's not something that just happens in one instance. Like, it happens at such kind of like a broad spectrum. But yeah, I think within my experience, the big thing for me when I slowly was like, I did kind of realize that what happened to me, a huge part of that was that my parents believed me and they supported me, and that was never in doubt. Neither was any of my friends. None of my friends turned around and went, well, actually, are you sure? And I don't think I realized just how much I took that for granted, because I just thought that was everyone's experience, but obviously that is not the case. And that's kind of when I started looking into that kind of thing, it was this idea of, well, race plays into that further. And I think because I had such a supportive kind of like network, I don't know what I would have done without them. Like, I don't think I would be here, because they really were who I depended on. And I think without that, I think if you can't tell your family, if you can't tell your friends, in this idea that you're not going to be believed, then that has a huge kind of like mental toll that I didn't really appreciate, I think.
Yeah, and I guess having read the blog post, I think there's a few nuances from what happened in every situation that I picked up on that I would obviously like to have your opinion on. I guess one of the sort of situations you brought up was saying that essentially you were trying to put across an opinion that, not put across an opinion, you were telling the person you were with that you didn't have any protection, and you're having to make excuses essentially, so you wouldn't have sex. And they were essentially saying that, they didn't really care, and they went ahead and did it anyway. I mean, what aspect of that do you think is important for us to like highlight? Because from what I'd read from that is basically you having to make up excuses, as opposed to the conversation of being no means no. I mean, the fact that you had to come up with an excuse, and that's part of the story. And it's an aspect of, people will ask you, I suppose, why didn't you just say no? You'd be like, oh, I did, and I made up this excuse. I mean, that isn't something that really should be happening. I mean, what do you think of that situation in terms of women having to make up excuses as to why they don't want to,
Yeah. It is obviously within this huge issue. It's like, so within that situation, I had said no anyway at the start. And obviously it's just that complete coercive kind of like, no, they just continue to push it. And it's this idea that, well, maybe if you say this, and obviously it's this idea that if you give an excuse that could then affect them, then obviously I thought that idea of him being a potential father to a illegitimate child would make him stop, and it just didn't. And I think for people who haven't been assaulted, or for people who don't really understand, it's this idea that I don't know, that they will just go to any length. That even you can give an excuse that could affect them, and you could go that far, and they still think, well, nah, it's not important enough. I think there's an issue within that I should have, I said, well, no, I did say no, and that should have been the end of it. But I feel that's a whole other conversation. But yeah, it's this idea. It just goes to show that if someone wants to do it, they'll do it. It doesn't really matter the circumstances or the nuances. They will go ahead and do it.
Which kind of fits into my sort of second question about one of the other scenarios that you'd outlined in the blog post, which is about if they want to do it, then they'll go ahead and do it. But then for those who are in a higher position of power as well, you'd spoken about, and one of the experiences, that the person you were with were in a position of power. I wanted to know what your sort of perspective was on that, like how much of an impact did that have on that sort of situation that was different to the others?
I don't know how much to go into it. So essentially, he was well recognized. Let's say, I wouldn't say he was famous, but people know who he is. He's a professional sports player, and I think it was kind of that idea that I knew I was going to his place, and I knew that was happening. But obviously, I very much within that situation, I know how far I want to go, and I think stupidly, or it shouldn't be stupidly, but quite naively, I think that someone's going to listen to that. But I think the fact that he was a recognised sports player, and he was quite a bit older as well, that very much played in kind of like this idea of pressure, and then the coercion, and kind of being like, well, then why are you saying no to this person? They're famous. It was kind of like, I should have felt lucky to be there. I should have felt lucky that I should have even been like picked. So I shouldn't be complaining at the fact that it went ahead. Like I should consider myself lucky. And I just kind of remember his attitude afterwards was disgusting, and it was just this whole idea of, well, that's it, done, that's it, get your coat, you're going. And I was there like, right, okay. And I think very much because he knows who he is, and he knows that people know who he is, he feels like, and he feel like that he can get away with it, and he can, because it happened, and he probably thinks nothing of it.
And I guess just the final one, and also the specifics and things, like, I guess just to open up, like in the last part of the conversation, before we go on to I guess rounding it back towards obviously the aspect of the ethnic minority part, coinciding with this, I suppose it's one of the more commonly professed sort of aspects of stories like this to do with sexual assault, which is the inclusion of alcohol within the story. I think you'd put within like the first sort of experience you said there. I just wanted to, obviously, I think I know what your answer will be, but I wanted also your perspective on that, in terms of people trying to put in the perspective of you should have been a bit more careful, or handle yourself better with alcohol, be around friends, and all this sort of aspect. I mean, what's your opinion, perspective, and what would you say to people that would try to profess that sort of argument?
Well, I think the third assault really puts that into kind of, it just completely, I was with people I trusted. I had had more to drink because I was with the guy, and I knew the guy, and we weren't like in a relationship, but we were somewhat exclusive. It was going that way, and the only other people who were there were his flatmate and his flatmate's girlfriend, again, who I was very kind of like, I knew I was friends with. It wasn't like I'd just kind of gone into a bunch of strangers. So I was in a position in which would have been regarded as safe. I then got far too intoxicated, to the point that I was throwing up, and he was helping me throw up. So it's not kind of like this idea that he didn't know how much I'd had to drink. He knew how kind of out of it I was. And then whilst I was passed out from the drink, that's when he assaulted me. And I think it just goes to show that, again, if someone's going to do it, they're going to do it. Like, that's someone I trusted. That's someone I knew. People knew that I was seeing the guy. It wasn't like this secret thing. So my friends knew that I was seeing him. My parents knew I was seeing him, all of which those people kind of like trusted. So yeah, I think it's this idea of, well, you had too much to drink. What do you think of your environment? I just think it completely throws it out the window, because if you're not meant to feel safe with the guy that you're seeing and his friends, one of which was female, then what place can you get intoxicated in? When does that then become your responsibility? Because then that's just essentially saying, well, you should never drink just in case someone rapes you.
Yeah, or just, never go outside, I suppose. And I guess a natural sort of transition for the and I'm speaking, I guess, from the not a devil's advocate perspective, because that's an awful thing to do, right? But I'm guessing, speaking from the random Instagram boy sort of like type comment, I suppose the aspect they've come from is, why don't you just report it sort of aspect, or that sort of thing, that justification. And how would you sort of answer that perspective, that as to, if these things have happened, why didn't you go down that route, etc. And I guess after that, I guess we'll move straight on to how this intersects with the minority part. So obviously we keep on.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously it's so hard to prove. I think that's just the completely overlying argument, is this idea is that, well, I can prove that they slept with me, but how can I prove that it was not consensual? It's not like I recorded it. It's not like there's something that shows that I said no. And I think that's the really, really big thing. But then I think another thing, and I have had the comments before, like I have had the comments on Instagram being like, well, boys just being like, oh, why did you not report it? Having no idea of just kind of like, that then forms, it's still those kind of boys that form the justice system. Like it's an old boys club. It's an old white man club, in the sense that it's very much within their power. I never reported it because I heard so many horror stories of people, and people I'm close to, who had actual evidence of being assaulted, and like the bruises, the wounds, whatever. And I would never say that any of the three of my sexual assaults, none of them were violent as such. Like they didn't lay a hand on me. And my friends who had been through that were still getting it completely pushed out of court, even though the evidence was there. And I think when it comes to that kind of comment, is that people don't listen within the justice system. People don't. The biggest, obviously, is the fact is, where's the evidence? But also, they don't. There's just a lack of care there. There's a reason why there are so many cases just completely don't even make it to court, and then the actual amount of perpetrators that are actually jailed is so. There's a reason why people don't come forward, and it's because, and then that just all interferes kind of like with each other, and then it's just a vicious cycle. And that's not going to come without a whole change in attitudes and reforms of systems. So I think that's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, but I think so. It's quite good about yourself and also your organization, Be Like Lilith, is that you're opening up these conversations to have a lot more level of depth to the conversation than, for example, the questions I've kind of generally asked towards the start of this podcast is obviously the sort of questions people usually have every single time they start off with somebody who's a sexual assault survivor. They'll ask these questions, and the level of nuance that there is after that is never really discussed or entertained, or people care about because they just want to know the facts of like, oh, well, clearly if the situation ever happened to either themselves or a girl that they know specifically, or a guy that they know, they'll be like, clearly it was just a straightforward process. Clearly we live in a first world country. Why would this be a problem if someone had this?
Yeah.
So I think it's amazing work that you're doing with be like Lilith and obviously trying to open this up. And I think it's quite great as part of the melting. So obviously you're open to obviously creating the nuance on these sort of discussions. And I guess that's the part that I want to come to now, is basically the aspect of, like, you'd spoken about misogynoir and the Me Too movement. And I don't know if a lot of people really know about sort of these aspects and how they relate to it. So I don't know if you'd like to explain it a little bit more.
Yeah, so obviously everyone kind of remembers the Me Too movement kicking off kind of after kind of like Harvey Weinstein, which was back in 2017. Whereas the Me Too movement was started by Tanya Burke back in 2006. And I think it just goes to show that once kind of like a couple of white women come forward against a guy, there's this huge, and I'm not saying that the Me Too movement
Tanya Burke, a black woman, who'd started the movement. Sorry, just make that clear.
So I'm not saying the Me Too movement wasn't great, like the fact that it opened that kind of discussion, but it had been created 11 years before that, and black women who were driving this movement had said the exact same things, and it just didn't gain the same traction because of race, because of skin color. And I think something I always read when it comes to this is that black women had been saying for years about R. Kelly and about how much of a predator he was and how bad he was. And it was only really when white people started to call it out and people were like, oh, well, what he's done is disgusting. Whereas black women had been saying for 4 years that this was happening. It just wasn't believed. So yeah, I think that's the big thing when it comes to, obviously no one who is sexually assaulted is having a good time of it, but then we kind of have to realize, well, how is that made worse by your skin color or your ethnic background? And I think that's all kind of what it plays into. And then obviously misogynoir is that within kind of like, so black women, and especially when they're sexual assault survivors, they're not only just facing that kind of like misogynist kind of, like you said, with boys kind of asking those questions, they're then getting that doubly because they're black. And they're more likely kind of like not to be believed or not listened to or not kind of given that attention because they're a black woman.
Yeah, because of all obviously the aspects we've spoken about earlier in terms of with the police and with the NHS and and those sort of perspectives, and obviously the therapy and inclusion, obviously the cultural aspects. So you got not even 1 or 2 layers, you got 2, 3, 4, 5 different layers on top of that. And something that strikes me as quite glaringly sort of blatant, I guess, the differences in terms of how much these discussions are actually entertained is I watched a little bit of the R. Kelly documentary, but I watched the whole Harvey Weinstein sort of like series that they had on it. And obviously, I think the thing that came across for me is the Harvey Weinstein sort of situation was an elaborate sort of scheme of, different layers and things like that. And he had like different people involved in how he paid the kids and how he got them involved. And there was all of that. Whereas R. Kelly, I think it was just, they said just openly knew that this guy was hanging around outside of high schools. I mean, you're talking about something that's completely elaborate sort of situation with very, very like the most powerful people in the world compared to this guy's literally just hanging around outside of a school and still nobody said anything.
Well, he was, I think at one point he was married to a 15-year-old and people were just like, well, yeah, that's fine. That's okay. And I think, completely. It's comparing the two. And it's, I don't know, it's difficult in the sense that, I don't know, it's obviously outing that kind of scheme in which Harvey Weinstein was kind of involved with, obviously needed to be done. But yes, in comparison, when people know that these things are happening and these like people are speaking out about it and people are still just kind of like turning that blind eye, it kind of just seems that people go to more effort to kind of uncover things when it affects their skin color instead of where something's kind of like blatantly obvious and in front of them and they're like, oh, it's not our business.
Yeah, So I think that's quite we went into quite a bit like today and things like that. I think that's obviously good enough for us to stop on that sort of subject. But I think what's really good about this episode as well is obviously as we go into do other podcast episodes and things like that, we don't really need to return to a lot of the stories and discussion we've had about this now. We can obviously go into more depth and detail about obviously the next blog posts and things like that you'll be coming up with, and it just means that throughout this podcast we can go through a process of really getting into the topic and really discussing the nuances of these aspects that obviously you're working with through Be Like Lilith or through the White Ribbon Scotland. And I think it's fantastic what you're doing, and also I really appreciate the aspect of yourself putting in the intersectionality within the sort of discussion, obviously with yourself being obviously half Chinese, half white and things like that, so you understand both perspectives. And it's something that I really do believe needs to have a much more elevated sort of conversation within Scotland. I mean, within Scotland, I mean, I guess throughout all that's really happened, obviously the last like 5, 6, 7 years or so. I mean, towards like, you know, the what's happened obviously with these football clubs and things like that, or just generally within obviously the church and things like that. I guess even so, I still don't believe within Scotland this has really come to the fore. Maybe down south and obviously in the States and things like that, I feel as if these conversations are a lot more elevated. But I, for one, can't really think of any situation or any sort of discussion within the mainstream media that has really brought this to Scotland locally. It's something that's kind of generally maybe UK wide or European wide or something that's on a global scale, but we've never really tackled with it on a one-to-one scale within our own community. And I think it's obviously fantastic work you've been doing, obviously with your actual work and obviously with your group and things like that. And I'm really excited to see obviously what sort of conversations we can have and find out more for myself. I can learn a lot more, and so can also all of our listeners. So thank you very much for sharing your story with us today, Rebekah. I really appreciate it. But yeah, I think that's the end of episode 3. And if you enjoyed listening to Rebekah, then check out her page, Be Like Lilith, and I'm sure from there you can find her personal, which is one of my favorite pages on Instagram. She's just drama all day, every day. But you know, what else can you expect from somebody who is, what is it?
Painfully self-obsessed. Yeah,
not self-proclaimed. Actually, yeah. So, but yeah, follow Rebekah. You won't regret it. So, yeah. Until next time. Cool.